Welcome back everybody, my name is Blister again, and I'm glad to have you here. Today we're going to be continuing our trend of talking about things that make us all love classic WoW. Today I'm going to be bringing you our top 10 zones in classic WoW. Before we get into this, I do want to say that I had initially intended on this being just a top 5 list, but after reading through the forums, I found that narrowing it down to just 5 zones was going to be nearly impossible. In fact, it would have been easier to do a top 5 alliance zones and a top 5 horde zones. That being said, it should be obvious that I tried to be objective as possible here in terms of selecting the top 10. If I had made this my own top 10 list, I could have certainly narrowed it down to just 5. In terms of our ranks here, they're not really ranks. It would be very hard to rank these from worst to best in terms of a top 10. So for this video, we're just going to talk about the top 10 general best zones in no particular order. Anyways, without any more babbling, let's get into our list. First off, we're going to talk about Winterspring. Winterspring is one of the handful of snow-covered zones that we got in Classic. There aren't a terrible amount of quests in this zone for the Horde, but it does offer a decent amount for Alliance players. The quests that were offered in this zone were actually pretty decent for their XP and gold return. A lot of people, mainly Alliance, would head there a few levels before they could even get quests just to farm the beasts until they hit level 57. The Frost Sabers in particular were good for farming, particularly if you were a Skinner because of how fairly fast they actually respawn. Wintergrass was also a favorite for hunters because there was a large variety of level 60 beasts that you could tame. And the last thing to note on this zone, it is also a part, albeit a small part, of the Onyxia attunement questline. Next up we have Elwynn Forest. This zone is probably my favorite zone. In fact, I loved this zone so much that regardless of what race I chose when I was playing Alliance, I would figure out a way to get to Elwynn just to do this as my first zone. The music, the visual, the quests, I loved everything about it. The zone was almost perfect. In fact, it was so well made that there were hardly any changes made to the zone after the Cataclysm revamp. For the first zone after a starting area, this zone was very well done. It really had it all. There were kill quests, there were collect quests, there were adventure quests, there were fetch quests, and there were even a group quest for Hogger. Not only that, this zone's storylines continue into other zones as well, making them all feel like an extension of one another compared to a new story for each zone you travel to. And next up, right next to Elwynn Forest is Westfall. Like I mentioned about Elwynn Forest leading into other zones, one of the zones is Westfall. Westfall continued with the stories from Elwynn Forest, while adding new ones and compounding what we already had. Westfall also gave us one of the best dungeons in Classic with the Dead Mines. One of the very first quests you get in the zone is to start taking out members of the Defias Brotherhood. You're also tasked with helping poor peasants scattered throughout the zone by taking out threats or getting them items to make their food. All of this climaxes with taking out Van Cleef in the Dead Mines. Starting off as a human and working through Elwynn Forest into Westfall and going all the way through all the quests and defeating Van Cleef in the Dead Mines felt like it was an accomplishment within itself. That entire story arc felt like it could have been its own game. Next up we have Duskwood. Duskwood is another one of my favorite zones, and for multiple reasons. It again is another continuation of lower level story arcs for the Alliance. Duskwood is where Alliance players really start to see the darker side of the storytelling from Classic WoW. A lot of the quests revolve around things that we wouldn't come to see in WoW nowadays. We see people losing loved ones, or murderers, or necromancy. The zone is just creepy. If you played through Naxxramas, you're familiar with the screaming and unsettling atmosphere of parts of that raid. Imagine that just all being in one big zone. If you need any further proof, look at the map. Roughly 1/5 of the entire map is just a graveyard. And there are multiple layers to that graveyard for you to explore. There's an underground and above ground area. The zone itself is also very dark itself. It can be hard to actually see some things more than 30 feet in front of you because of the haze. Something that not a lot of players know is that Duskwood is actually so haunting because it's actually been cursed. It was cursed when Medivh died. Duskwood used to actually be known as Brightwood, but once Brightwood was cursed, it became Duskwood. Next up, we have the Hinterlands. This zone wasn't necessarily one of my favorites, but it did have one of my most favorite spots in Classic. On the bottom right corner of the map is a troll city / palace type place known as Jin Tha Alor. The reason why I like this spot so much is because it was almost like an open world dungeon of sorts. There were quests that required you to journey through the area, which made it even better. It was almost like a small scale Zul'Gurub for leveling up. Cyrodiil in the top right corner is also a spot where the Dragons of Nightmare spawn. The Dragons of Nightmare were 4 world bosses that were added in Classic right before the Encourage opened. If you were on a PvP server, the world bosses could be very good or very bad for you in terms of a memory. It was not uncommon for a full 40-on-40 raid battle to occur next to these world bosses. Aside from all of this, the Hinterlands are actually a pretty decent spot for farming and for XP. Un'Goro Crater. Un'Goro was a very unique zone back in the day. There were just dinosaurs everywhere. So if you were a dinosaur fan growing up or just loved Jurassic Park, this is a great zone for you. Aside from the dinos, there are giant gorillas, ooze mobs, and even fire elementals. There's a giant volcano right smack dab in the middle of the map, but the rest of the zone is just a lush green jungle. To top all of that off, it's surrounded by deserts with Tanaris, Silithus, and Thousand Needles on all sides. I'm not quite sure how that worked out, but I'm okay with it. Aside from all this, the zone was excellent for leveling. There wasn't a plethora of quests per se to do, but the farming was very good. And again, if you were a skinner / leatherworker like you were in Winterspring, you could make a decent chunk of change while you're actually grinding. Next up, we have Hillsbrad Foothills. Terran Mill versus South Shore. Do I really have to say anything else? Terran Mill and South Shore were not all that far away from each other, which meant that if you were in the area, you were bound to run into someone of the opposing faction. There was so much PvP that occurred on a regular basis here that Blizzard actually added a temporary 40v40 battleground called Terran Mill vs South Shore. Besides the always fun mass scale open world PvP that this zone brought us, there were also loads of lore behind it as well. The first battle of the second war between the Horde and the Alliance took place in this area. And it was also a high point for the Scourge during the Third War when the Scourge were able to successfully capture South Shore. The massive amounts of PvP that happens in this in Classic is actually very in line with what happens historically in this zone. Personally, I love how Blizzard was able to make this zone almost like a continuation of the constant fighting that occurred here to quote-unquote continue the conflict. And for the most part, people didn't even know what they were contributing to. Next up, we're going to talk about Tanaris. There were 3 main reasons why, in my opinion, this is one of the most popular zones in Classic. Firstly, Gadget Zan. Gadget Zan has 2 things going for it. It has a boat that comes right from Booty Bay. Booty Bay, for those who are not familiar with it, is on the southern tip of Stranglethom Vale. Leveling through STV and then going straight to Tanaris was not uncommon. They led into each other fantastically. Gadget Zan also had an auction house in it. Not only that, but the auction house was actually a neutral auction house, meaning that both Alliance and Horde members could sell and buy from this auction house. The second great part of Tanaris is the questing. There are a lot of grinding style quests in Tanaris, which would easily give you a few levels while leveling up. And the third part is Zul'Farrak. Zul'Farrak was actually run quite a bit back in Classic. There were good items and a lot of mobs, which meant you were going to get a lot of XP. The aesthetics of the dungeon itself were actually pretty awesome as well. Next up, we're going to talk about the Plaguelands. I threw the 2 of these zones together because I saw both of them quite a bit. However, I will say I saw Eastern show up just a bit more than Western. Either way, the Plaguelands were loved by almost everyone in Classic. There were loads of reasons to love the Plaguelands. There was the Argent Dawn reputation that almost every raider wanted to get. The Argent Dawn offered shoulder enchants which were very hard to come by in Classic. There were also very valuable enchanting recipes that you could learn from the Argent Dawn as well. These two zones were also dripping in Warcraft lore. If you watched our top dungeons video, you'll know how important Stratholme is to a lot of people. Well, guess where it was located? Eastern Plaguelands. The final raid tier of Classic, Naxxramas, was also located in the Plaguelands, and the attunement quest was located also in the Eastern Plaguelands. In the Western Plaguelands, we are also treated with where Uther the Lightbringer's tomb is. Uther is most well known for being killed by Arthas in Warcraft 3. The Plaguelands were also loaded with places for farming crafting materials. And again, enchanters would farm for the Crusaders enchant at Tyr's hand. I could go on for hours about these two zones, but I don't want to talk your ears off. If you want to find out more about these two zones, I would suggest checking out the Classic WoW Wiki. And the last zone I want to bring up is Stranglethom Vale. In all the reading through forum posts and Reddit threads, this was by far the most commonly picked zone for one of their top 5 favorites. It wasn't always number 1, but I would say at least 60% of people at least had it somewhere on their list. This zone was amazing back in the day. There were loads of quests, and it had a great level range. There were plenty of mobs in tight spaces that were relatively easy to farm. And for some, best of all, this was another one of the first zones where Horde and Alliance players really started to interact with each other on a regular basis. Before STV, running into a player of the opposing faction, it wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't commonplace like it was in STV. The biggest exception of that being Hillsbrad Foothills. However, the Garabushi Arena was also a nice addition to this zone. The arena was where you could fight even members of your own faction. The reward for doing this was that there was a chest that dropped level 50 unique bracers of all armor types, along with some greens and some extra coin. Another great part of this zone was Zul'Gurub. Zul'Gurub was a 20-man troll-themed raid that was popular enough for Blizzard to even bring back as a 5-man heroic dungeon in Cataclysm. And those are our top zones from Classic. What do you guys think? What is your favorite zone? Was one of our zones one of your least favorite? Let us know down in the comments. As always guys, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey, it's Radit here. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. We put out multiple new videos each week and we appreciate all of your support. Thanks for watching everyone and cheers.